The investigation stalled almost immediately. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no notes, no blood. The prevailing theory became abduction by an outsider, someone passing through, someone already gone. It was easier that way. The church disabled the bell mechanism within the week, citing safety concerns. Margaret Cole stopped playing the organ shortly after and never explained why. The town buried its questions alongside its certainty that God would not allow something like this to happen without reason. Years passed. Children grew up. Parents grew old. St. Brigid's continued to stand, silent and unchanged, its bell tower sealed, its secrets locked behind stone and faith. But some nights, when the rain fell hard enough, people would wake suddenly, hearts racing, convinced they had heard a sound that no longer existed, a bell that rang only once. And in 2025, when the walls finally began to come down, the town would learn that the bell had not been calling anyone to prayer at all. It had been marking the moment everything went wrong. Ashford Hollow had learned how to forget without realizing it was doing so. By the time the county announced St. Brigid's Church would be demolished in the spring of 2025, most residents no longer associated the building with the children who vanished there. The church had become background, an aging structure with locked doors and boarded windows, something people drove past without slowing down. Its history had thinned into rumor. Some said it was unsafe, others said it was cursed. No one said it had been designed to hide anything. That assumption would not survive the first day of demolition. The demolition crew arrived just after sunrise. Yellow equipment idled quietly on the wet gravel, while the foreman, Ray Hollister, walked the perimeter with a clipboard, checking the fencing and warning signs. The air smelled of damp leaves and rusted metal. Birds circled above the bell tower, unsettled by the sudden activity. The plan was simple. Take down the roof first, then the tower, then the stone walls. No one expected resistance. Stone is supposed to give way when pushed hard enough. The first problem appeared less than an hour in. When the crew began removing the outer stonework near the base of the bell tower, they found a secondary wall behind it. Not structural, not decorative, just a narrow layer of stone laid too precisely to be accidental. It was older than the outer wall, darker, and sealed with mortar that did not match the rest of the building. Hollister stopped the work and called the county inspector. That delay would change everything. When the cavity was opened, the air that escaped was cold and dry, carrying a faint odor that no one could identify at first. It wasn't rot, it wasn't mold, it was something older, something closed off from time. A worker shined a flashlight inside and swore under his breath. Hanging from a wooden beam were 3 lengths of rope, stiff with age. Each rope ended in a loop. Below them, placed carefully against the stone floor, were 3 pairs of children's shoes. They were not scattered, they were aligned. The site was shut down immediately. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, then state police, then investigators who had not expected to reopen a case buried for more than 60 years. News traveled faster than the rain. By afternoon, half the town stood behind police tape, staring at the church as if seeing it for the first time. Some people cried, some refused to look, a few turned away entirely, as though distance could undo what had already been uncovered. Detective Laura Mendez arrived just before dusk. She had spent nearly 3 decades working unresolved disappearances, most of them ending without answers. She did not believe in coincidence. She walked the site slowly, touching nothing, watching everything. The ropes told her more than the shoes. They were positioned too evenly. The beam had been reinforced. The cavity had not been used for storage. It had been built for a purpose. Inside the sealed space, scratched deeply into the stone, were names. Not initials, not symbols, full names, carved with force and repetition, as if whoever did it needed them to remain. Caleb Rourke, Emily Shaw,
Jonah Price. Laura did not need a file to recognize them. Every officer in the state had trained on the case at least once as an example of how people vanish without evidence. Now the evidence was carved into the wall itself. Ground-penetrating radar was ordered the same night. Laura stood outside the church as the equipment passed back and forth over the floor of the nave. The monitor showed irregular voids beneath the stone, rectangular, deliberate, evenly spaced. Not graves, chambers. Her stomach tightened. Churches were not built like this by accident. As the town absorbed the shock, old residents began remembering details they had never connected. Locked doors during late rehearsals, the way Father Callahan insisted children remain silent when moving through certain parts of the building, the sudden repairs made to the bell tower in the late 1950s, overseen personally by the priest. At the time, it had been described as modernization. Now, it looked like preparation. Ethan Cole arrived in Ashford Hollow the night the radar results came back. He had not planned to stay long. His aunt's funeral was over. The house was sold. But in his car, wrapped in an old sweater, was the cassette tape he had found hidden beneath a false panel in her cedar chest. The label read only, "Easter Night, 1962. Margaret Cole had never married, never had children. She had lived quietly and died quietly, but she had not forgotten. Laura Mendez listened to the tape alone in an unmarked car, parked across from the church. Margaret's voice was thin, strained, recorded years after the fact, but still heavy with restraint. She described hearing the bell, described knowing someone had pulled it, described climbing partway up the tower and stopping when she heard voices below her, low and calm, speaking words that did not sound like prayer. She named Father Callahan. She described the smell of incense mixed with something metallic. She admitted she had done nothing. Margaret said she was told the children were being tested, that suffering made faith permanent, that their removal was protection, not punishment. She believed him at least long enough to walk away, long enough to let the bell stop ringing. The tape ended with a warning. The walls were built to keep them from being found, not from escaping. The next morning, excavation began beneath the nave. What they found there would remove any remaining doubt that St. Brigid's had been a place of worship alone. It had also been a place of design, a place where silence was engineered, and whatever was sealed inside was never meant to be forgiven. The first stone slab was lifted just after 6:30 a.m., and the sound it made was wrong. It was not the hollow crack investigators expected when uncovering old ground. It was muted, absorbed, as if the space beneath had been waiting. Cold air pushed upward through the opening, carrying the unmistakable smell of confinement, dust, mineral dampness, and something long deprived of oxygen. Laura stepped closer and knew immediately that this was not a burial site. It was a room. The chamber beneath the nave was narrow, barely wide enough for an adult to stand comfortably. The walls were lined with smooth stone, intentionally shaped, with no signs of collapse or erosion. This was not crude construction. Whoever built it understood permanence. The floor sloped slightly toward a shallow drain that led nowhere. There were no windows, no ventilation, no light source. In one corner lay skeletal remains, curled inward, wrapped in decayed fabric that had once been a choir robe. The medical examiner, Dr. Simon Kessler, arrived shortly after. He did not speak at first. He crouched, examined bone placement, measured distances with gloved fingers. The skeleton belonged to a child. Age estimate placed it between 9 and 11. The wrists were bound. The bindings were rosary beads, knotted tightly enough that grooves had been worn into the bone over time. This child had not been killed quickly. This child had been left. As the second chamber was opened, Laura noticed a pattern. The spacing between rooms was precise. Each was equidistant from the altar above. The church had not simply been built over these spaces, it had been aligned with them. Someone stood where the priest once preached and knew exactly what lay below him. The third chamber was the hardest to enter. The opening had been partially sealed from inside, stones pushed toward the entrance in a desperate attempt to block someone or something. The remains inside were positioned differently, upright, back pressed to the wall, the skull tilted slightly upward, jaw parted. Dr. Kessler would later suggest it prolonged vocalization, screaming, calling out, until the body could no longer produce sound. Cause of death in all three cases was ruled the same: dehydration, compounded by exposure and psychological stress. Time to death was estimated between 3 and 5 days. They had been alive after Easter morning. Laura stood over the chambers and imagined
Mechanical failure. Said God would reveal the truth in time. Winslow had been raised Catholic. He closed the investigation after 6 months, citing lack of evidence. He died in 1989. Margaret Cole had attended his funeral and said nothing. In 2025, as forensic reports were released, the town fractured. Some residents refused to accept what the evidence showed. They insisted the priest had been misunderstood, that the chambers had another purpose, that the children's suffering was exaggerated. Laura had seen this reaction before. Faith, once threatened, did not collapse quietly. It fought. Ethan Cole read his aunt's diary while investigators worked. Page after page described sleepless nights, guilt, and fear. She wrote about hearing sounds beneath the floor during services for years afterward, tapping, settling stone, echoes that felt like movement. She wrote that Father Callahan had told her the church was holding something back, that God demanded sacrifice but rewarded obedience. She wrote that she had thought the children were already dead when the bell rang. She had been wrong. On the final page, written in unsteady handwriting, Margaret confessed she believed the chambers were not meant to kill. They were meant to contain, to isolate, to purify through suffering. Death, she wrote, was an acceptable outcome, but not the goal. The goal was endurance. Laura Mendez stared at the church as night fell on the third day of excavation. Floodlights illuminated the exposed floor, the open cavities, the truth no amount of stone could hide anymore. She realized then that the investigation was no longer about how the children died. It was about why no one stopped it. Because someone had designed those chambers believing they would never be discovered. Because someone believed God was on their side. And because silence had been the final, most effective wall of all. Father Patrick Callahan did not disappear the way criminals usually do. There were no frantic withdrawals, no abandoned vehicle on the side of a road, no witnesses who remembered a man running or hiding. He vanished cleanly, deliberately, the way someone does when they believe disappearance is not an escape, but a continuation. On the morning after Easter Sunday in 1962, he failed to appear for Mass. By noon, the rectory was empty. His clothes were gone. His personal papers were removed. His passport was missing. It was as if he had planned his absence long before the bell ever rang. Laura Mendez requested records from the diocese the same week the chambers were uncovered. What she received was incomplete. Gaps appeared in Callahan's assignment history, months unaccounted for, parishes listed without dates, transfers justified by vague language like spiritual necessity and pastoral restructuring. He had been moved frequently, always after complaints that were never formally recorded. No criminal accusations, no disciplinary actions, just quiet relocations, the kind designed to erase patterns rather than confront them. Callahan had arrived in Ashford Hollow in 1956. At the time, St. Brigid's was struggling. Attendance was declining. Repairs were needed. The town welcomed him eagerly. He was articulate, intense, deeply convincing. His sermons focused on endurance, obedience, and suffering as evidence of faith.
He spoke often about trials being hidden from the unworthy. People listened. People trusted him. That trust was the first material he used. Architectural records showed that major renovations were approved in 1958. The bell tower reinforcement, subfloor stabilization, drainage improvements, all requested by Father Callahan, all approved without question. The contractor who oversaw the work had died decades earlier, but his son remembered something. His father had said the priest insisted on supervising certain areas personally, areas beneath the nave, areas no one else was allowed to examine closely. Laura traced Callahan's education next. Seminary records described him as exceptional but rigid. He had studied obscure theological texts focused on voluntary suffering through isolation, fringe doctrines rejected by mainstream Catholic teaching. He wrote a thesis on voluntary suffering as divine containment. It was never published. It was quietly archived. The deeper Laura dug, the more intentional the pattern became. Callahan was not improvising. He was executing a belief system. In 1963, less than a year after the disappearances, a priest matching Callahan's description appeared briefly in rural Quebec under a different name. He stayed 6 months. Children there later reported being locked in a basement during catechesis lessons to test obedience. No investigation followed. The priest left before questions could form. Then there was Argentina. Immigration records showed a Patrick Calles arriving in Buenos Aires in 1965. Same birth year, same height, same scar above the left eyebrow, noted on his U.S. military chaplain records. He joined a small religious order operating outside formal Vatican oversight. They preached purification, silence, and withdrawal from modern corruption. Several members later disappeared. So did Calles. Laura Mendez sat in her office one night, surrounded by maps and timelines, and realized something unsettling. Callahan had not fled to avoid punishment. He had moved towards places where isolation was easier, where belief could be enforced without scrutiny, where silence was a tool, not a consequence. Back in Ashford Hollow, the town council met behind closed doors. Lawyers advised restraint. The diocese released a statement expressing sorrow without admitting responsibility. Some residents demanded the church be razed immediately. Others demanded it remain standing as a place of prayer. A few argued the children's suffering served a purpose no one should question. Laura watched these divisions deepen and understood how the chambers had remained hidden so long. Ethan Cole visited the excavation site alone one late evening. He stood where the altar had once been and imagined his aunt playing the organ, hearing what she heard, knowing what she knew, and choosing silence anyway. He realized then that Callahan had not acted alone. He had relied on fear, on reverence, on the belief that authority absolves responsibility. A final document arrived from the Vatican archives 2 weeks later, marked restricted. It referenced an internal review of Callahan in the early 1960s. The conclusion was brief. Priest exhibits dangerous fixation on doctrinal extremity. Removal advised. No follow-up was recorded. No confirmation of removal. Laura closed the file slowly. The priest who vanished had not been lost. He had been allowed to continue. And now, with the truth exposed beneath broken stone, the question was no longer whether Father Callahan would ever be found. The question was how many places like St. Brigid still existed, built carefully, silently, by people who believed suffering was sacred, and that God would forgive what humans refused to confront. Only one part remained, not the crime, not the cover-up, but what came after truth was finally spoken aloud. The demolition of St. Brigid's Church did not begin with ceremony. There were no prayers, no clergy present, no final blessing.
On a gray morning in late autumn, machines arrived and started removing stone the way they would any abandoned structure, slowly and without reverence. The decision had been framed as practical. The building was unsafe. The land would be repurposed. But everyone in Ashford Hollow understood the truth. The church could no longer be allowed to stand, not as memory, not as symbol, not as shelter for what had been hidden inside it. As the walls came down, people gathered at a distance. Some watched in silence. Others left as soon as the first stones fell. A few cried openly, not only for the children, but for the version of themselves that had once believed nothing evil could exist inside a place dedicated to God. The bell tower was taken last. When the bell was lowered, it did not ring. The mechanism had been removed years earlier, disabled without explanation, as if someone feared what sound might still remain inside the metal. Detective Laura Mendez submitted her final report 3 days later. It was over 400 pages long. It detailed construction records, witness statements, forensic timelines, institutional correspondence, and the psychological profile of a man who believed suffering was holy. It also listed every failure, every moment where doubt was ignored, every person who had authority and chose silence instead. No arrests were made. Most of those responsible were dead. Others claimed ignorance. The law, like faith, had its limits. The diocese issued a second statement. This one acknowledged historical misconduct, but emphasized
how a church could be redesigned to imprison children without anyone intervening. No answers came. Settlements were offered instead. Money where truth should have been. Some families accepted. Others refused. Ethan Cole attended the memorial service held months later on the land where St. Brigid's once stood. There were no hymns, just 3 stone benches beneath an iron frame shaped like a bell. It was intentionally hollow, intentionally silent. Each bench bore a name: Caleb, Emily, Jonah. The ages were carved beneath, frozen forever at the moment time abandoned them. Margaret Cole's tape was released to the public with the family's consent. Her voice spread across news broadcasts, podcasts, and court filings. People heard fear where there had once been devotion. They heard the sound of someone realizing too late that obedience can be a form of violence. Ethan listened to it only once more. That was enough. Ashford Hollow changed after that. Church attendance declined sharply. Some buildings closed, others rebranded. Trust, once fractured, did not return. Children grew up hearing a different version of Easter, one that did not include bells or choirs. Parents asked questions now. They demanded transparency. Silence lost its authority. Laura Mendez retired the following year. In her final interview, she was asked whether she believed justice had been served. She did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, she said justice requires presence, and presence had been absent when it mattered most. Truth, she said, is not the same thing as resolution. On the anniversary of the children's disappearance, a storm passed through Ashford Hollow. Heavy rain, low clouds, the kind of night that once carried a sound no one could forget. People slept lightly. Some woke suddenly, hearts racing, certain they had heard something familiar. But there was no bell. Only rain on rooftops. Only wind through trees. Only the knowledge that what was buried for decades had finally been uncovered, not because institutions chose honesty, but because time eroded the walls they trusted to keep their secrets. The bell that rang once in 1962 would never ring again, and this time the silence was not hiding anything. It was remembering.